Okay, everybody, welcome to the public element of Schools Forum. My name's Darren Christian. I'm the Vice Chair of Schools Forum. We have just held a regular scheduled meeting and we're now on to the public meeting. We are quorate, so we're going to make a start now. There is one small matter, which is item 4 has been deferred to another meeting which is taking place on the 26th of March, so we are not going to cover that item today. Item 4 has been removed from this agenda. So without further ado, I will just deal with apologies for absence, and I think we're going to have quite a few of those. Are we going to pick that up now, David, as a list?
Yes, we can do. I've had apologies from Hazel Danson, Carol Patterson, Michelle Lee, Louise Brown, Karen Colligan and Dave Wadsworth, and there are a number of others unaccounted for at the moment.
Yeah, it appears as if some have decided not to join the public meeting that were in the previous meeting just now. So we're going to move on now to the minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of November. And we'll take you through the minutes and we'll also check for accuracy on those. So item 2, 3, matters arising, page 1 I'm on. So we're on 3.1, no issues regarding accuracy. We looked at the Secretary of State's letter. We looked at overspending the schools funding, item 3.3, page over. We then discussed trade union facilities time. That one hasn't been picked back up yet with a note on that one. We will be picking that one back up later in the summer. 3.5, schools premises funding arrangements. 3.6, review of local specialist places. There is a review being done by Jane Friswell now, and that is, I think her report is now in. Item 4, Kirklees Education Learning Partnership Board. And there. 5, high needs. 6, financial implications arising out of COVID. There has been a report at the previous meeting that some schools have started to receive support from government where bids have been placed. Claims have been settled, certainly to some degree. Item 7, schools funding 2021-22, and that was an item just discussed previously in the previous meeting. Item 8, Central School Services block. Okay, nothing arising out of that. Annual Cabinet report on school funding.
That went through.
Say again, David?
That went through without challenge, so
Okay.
settlements approved.
Okay, that deals with the minutes and matters arising out of those minutes, and effectively it does deal with item 10, which confirms the minutes as well. So I'll now move on to what is effectively item 5, which is Kirklees Education Learning Partnership Board as a standing item. I think, Natalie, you deal with that?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I think also just to say that this meeting is being recorded and webcast. Just to pick that bit up, sorry. So the Education Learning Partnership Board last met on the 24th of February. The items that we looked at were around the high needs 10-point plan, an update around the plan, and progress that was being made. There is a refresh of the plan which will be shared and brought back to the Education Learning Partnership Board. There's work around a commission of Empower, which is working with the local authority and schools across to looking at SEND improvements and the workforce, the strategies and the plans around that, the work streams. We also had a presentation from Jane Witten and Stuart Horn around the mental health Trailblazer project, which had been really, really positively received in the schools that had been delivered in. We talked about the Alex Timpson offer and the real positive work and outcomes that were coming through, and also the opportunities for that to continue. We had an update from Val Flintoff around the relationship, sex and health education, and the work that was being done there. We had a discussion around the roadmap and the government's announcement about the return to schools from the 8th of March, and an update on the digital strategy and the impact of digital devices into schools over the course of the pandemic, where we have been able to deliver 6,500 laptops and devices to all of our schools over this time, and we do have some facility to be able to support that moving forward. I think that was the main essence of the conversation, unless colleagues have anything further to add from those discussions. Thanks, Darren.
All right, thanks, Natalie. Any other comments on that before we move on? Okay, that's excellent. Great news on the laptops, by the way. I'm a secondary head myself, and we definitely have benefited strongly from that, and it's made a huge difference, so fantastic. Okay, moving on to the high needs budget, standing item. Is there anything to cover on that one?
I noticed in last time's minutes of the public meeting that we were not in a position to tell you who'd replaced Ronnie Hartley as Head of Service for Inclusion. I hope I got the name right. It's Kelsey Clark Davis. Is that right, Natalie?
That's correct.
So she's now in post and starting work and having an impact and having to hit the ground running in certain respects. Joanne Sanders and I this week have been trying to refine the high needs cabinet report that is due to be considered on the 16th of March, looking at mainstream top-up funding. It's been through Children's Services leadership team and through the Council's executive team this week, and they were both very supportive of what was happening and gave some good advice as to how we should present the cabinet report at the meeting on the 16th of March. So you'll remember that the proposals are about giving all mainstream top-up funding an inflationary uplift, a long overdue inflationary uplift from the 1st of April 2021. And one of the options, the preferred option, also talks about some issues that we need to address in terms of giving schools some delegated funding for high needs issues, to workers' early intervention funding, if you like, to the layer below the education, health and care plan children, and also to look at the issue of those schools that have disproportionate numbers of EHCP children on roll. And one of the proposals is to give an element of floor funding to those schools to support the fact that they have to make many more £6,000 contributions than schools that don't have those high numbers of EHCPs. So clearly it's going to be a council decision as to whether that is implemented or implemented in a slightly different way. So we have to see what happens on the 16th of March, but as soon as we've got a decision, we'll be communicating that to schools. If it's a positive decision, then we'll be issuing new mainstream top-up statements for 21-22 as soon as possible, which I hope will be welcome across schools, because generally it will increase the amount of funding that you've got to play with in your budget for 21-22.
Okay, any other comments on that one, on that update? We're not required to vote on anything there. You're not seeking approval on anything. It's just an information item. That.
Yeah, there has been a high needs consultation launched in the last couple of weeks. I'm not absolutely certain that it's something that Forum need to respond to, because it's more about how the high needs national funding formula works in terms of recognition of historic spend that local authorities made on high needs issues. So there are two issues really. within the high needs national funding formula, when it was created, only 50% of that allocation was new in terms of new thought and new measures. 50% of the whole picture harked back to what local authorities used to be funded at for SEND. And over time, as more money is being tipped into the system, that 50% element of historic funding has comprised a lower proportion of the overall total. So the government, to help local authorities like ours that are struggling in particular with high needs spend, is proposing two changes to how the high needs national funding formula calculates. So that historic snapshot of what local authorities spent was based on what local authorities budgeted to spend back in 2017-18. And that was very different to what local authorities actually spent during 2017-18. So one of the proposals is to revisit that and replace the budget that everybody recorded with what they actually spent. If they do that, then that's worth a couple of million to Kirklees national funding formula allocation. So we'll obviously be supporting that change in the consultation response. They're also planning on boosting the proportion that the historic spending comprises of the total high needs national funding formula. So if they do that, then that will add another 3.5 million to our allocation. So providing, I suppose they've got a task now to actually convince the Treasury and the Chancellor that this is needed, and please find the money for it. So with that caveat, I think we should welcome the intention to review how the high needs national funding formula works, but just I question whether they've actually got the money to implement the outcome of the consultation. So we'll have to wait and see. I have had something this morning from the SFA wanting some further information on how we spent on resource provisions in the local authority back in 2017-18, because they can't actually pick that up from the statistics that are produced. So it may be that when we add that into the picture, then the potential benefit increases further from the 5.5 million that I've just taken you through. So it's interesting. I hope they'll be able to put the money behind it. And I hope it helps sort some of the deficit problem that we've got on the high needs account if that money starts to flow through and give us what we actually need to cover our high needs costs.
And to summarise, David, the closure of the consultation is when, and do you have any idea, if you know, and any idea when we get an outcome for this huge sum of, potentially huge sum of money for the local authority?
I think it runs through to the middle of April, so it's not going to be a quick solution. And then I presume they take all the consultation responses and consider what to do and how to approach the Treasury for the ask. I suppose there may be some local authorities, I think probably unusual, where it might cause a reduction in the level of high needs funding that they get within the dedicated schools grant, which might help pay for some of it. But I would expect it to be a big bill, I'm afraid. So we'll see what the Treasury says. So
we won't get, the funding won't come this financial year, then it will be the following April 2022, I would imagine, at the very earliest.
At the earliest, yes, that's right. They won't change what they've given us for 2021-22.
No. All right, that's really interesting, and you know, if that money comes, fantastic, because it's such an important area of the business that we undertake, supporting those most vulnerable. So thanks for that. Anything else on high needs? Anybody? Any comments or questions before we move on? Okay, thank you. So the ongoing financial implications arising out of the COVID health emergency, we wrote to the Secretary of State. I can certainly tell you that some schools have started to receive monies, and you wanted to cover something on this, David?
Yeah, I'm interested in that comment, Darren, because I thought all they'd paid out for was the claim for the summer term 2020 in terms of the additional costs that schools have incurred in terms of premises, in terms of PPE, in terms of additional cleaning. So I'm interested if you have managed to get something on top of that. That's not to say that they haven't provided additional funding in other ways. We've recently made the second instalment of the catch-up funding. You remember they'd allocated, I think it was £80 per pupil over the academic year that we're currently in, and we just made the second instalment of that funding to all our maintained schools. I presume academies have received theirs directly from the ESFA. But as you say, we've made a letter of complaint to the Secretary of State, actually invited him to attend a schools forum meeting, and we haven't had a reply, I'm afraid. So it's looking more and more unlikely that the DFE has the intention or the ability, in terms of what the Treasury have given them, to ride to schools rescue and address some of the unbudgeted COVID costs that they've incurred during this financial year. So conversations are taking place behind the scenes at the council as to what we do about that, because certainly a lot of budgets have been blown off course by the impact of COVID, and schools won't have as much money to carry forward at the end of this funding year into the next funding year, and that's going to have an impact on how they budget in 21-22. So we're looking to see whether there is any mileage in using some of the underspends that we're seeing in the DSG, in perhaps repurposing some of the grant funding that we've received. So conversations are going to be taking place over the next couple of weeks to see what we can do to support those schools that are heavily affected by additional COVID spend. And again, we appreciate that there's a need to provide clarity on that as soon as possible, because schools have started work on their budget plans for financial year 21-22. So if there's some more help coming, then they need to be made aware of that as soon as possible.
And it is at what level are those conversations taking place, David?
The Chief Finance Officer of the Council.
Okay. And so you will be reporting back to Schools Forum the outcome of that at some point?
Absolutely. If we know what the outcome is earlier than the next Schools Forum meeting, then we won't wait for the next Schools Forum meeting. It's so important to bring it into view so that schools know what the help is likely to be. I suppose I do have a bit of a concern. You remember we did an exercise back in November last year, writing round to all schools and all local academies to ask them to tell us, to that point, what they'd actually spent over and above what they'd budgeted for in terms of addressing the COVID situation. I'm not absolutely certain that we have the ability or the capacity to update that particular exercise. So one of the problems that we've got to solve is how we get to the heart of the problem for each individual school and quantify exactly what the issue is for each individual school, and therefore give us something to plan against in terms of helping the schools that have been the hardest hit. And it was clear in that exercise back in November that it's a bit of a mixed picture. There are certain schools that have been hit on every front. They've lost parental income because they've not been able to offer after-school clubs, breakfast clubs, daycare as normal throughout the period. There are other schools that have really suffered in terms of staff absence, and not all of that's been offset by whatever absence insurance they've managed to take out. And there are other issues, but equally there are schools that have been lucky enough to manage the situation very well and only had minimal expense on PPE and creating bubble working, all that sort of thing. So understandably, we'll be wanting to focus on those schools that have been the hardest hit first, to use any scarce money to help them out. So hopefully the picture will emerge over the next few weeks and we'll be able to give schools some clarity on what support we might be able to give.
I imagine an approach you could take, rather than go through the whole exercise of everybody producing a return, is to, if there are additional funds, is to look at some sort of bidding system where people apply if they feel that they've been, harder hit. Because I think a lot of the schools will have definitely had the heavy costs offset in that first term by the school closure from January to March. I certainly know that's the case with us, because our ongoing costs to do with additional hours and to do with cover for absent colleagues, they really did rebalance for us. So for me, a possible approach is some sort of bidding system where, if schools are really struggling, they will be the first to apply, I would imagine. Then others that aren't say, well, we don't need to apply because our costs are being offset now. Just a thought. Any other comments on that?
That sounded like an argument that the SFA have been putting forward, that, don't focus on the extra costs. There have been some opportunities for saving during the period. You won't have spent on other items that you were planning to spend on. So we need to look at the whole picture, I think. I accept that. That
is definitely true, especially since school closure. I can tell you that. We were headed for big trouble in the cover budget, but obviously that's completely stopped now. And we're hoping that when we return after March, the situation with the vaccines and all the rest of it means that, and the level of the virus in the community, means that we should have, in theory, less absence as we approach the summer term. Anyway, we shall see, and that's obviously in the hands of you and the Chief Executive Officer there, Chief Finance Officer. Okay, anything else on item 7? Okay, that one's done, thank you. Item 8 then, it's you again, David, the DSG settlement for 21-22.
Yeah, there's just a few things to bring into public view to tidy up 21-22. So I'm going to share my screen on a certain bits of it. So the first thing is the Central School Services block. In the minutes for the 27th of November, we had a draft position in the Central School Services block. What I need to register in the minutes and today is the final position for the Central School Services block for 21-22. So this is money that comes direct to the council within the dedicated schools grant to address a number of system costs that the council incurs. So there's the servicing of the schools forum, there's some pension commitments that are paid for from the dedicated schools grant, there's our school admissions and planning service, school organisation and planning service, a school reorganisation budget that we bring to schools forum every year to show how we've spent. There's the national copyright licence charge that is charged centrally to this pot rather than each school having to arrange a number of copyright licence arrangements for themselves. This year there's a new contribution for centrally employed teachers. The pay and pension grants are disappearing in 21-22, so they've given us a bit of a contribution to the costs of employing teachers centrally. And then the balance is the range of legal responsibilities that we have for all pupils educated in Kirklees, regardless of whether they're educated in maintained schools or in academies. So that 2,274,500 is slightly different to what was in the minutes back in November, but that's how we're planning to spend our school services block in 21-22. So just a bit of business to tidy up there.
It's only a minuscule point in the grand scheme of the financing at this level, but that 31 grand, given the fact that we're all online now and all the rest of it, is there a bit of a saving to be made there, David?
Yes, there could be, because the actual cost of venue hire has come out of the schools forum budget in the past, so there should be a saving in the interim period. Whether in the future things return to normal and we all get back in a room together, we'll have to see.
Yeah, okay. Just a minor point. Anything else? Any other questions or comments on the DSG for 21-22?
I have a couple more things to share. just a basic reminder of the DSG settlement figures, because again they weren't minuted on the 27th of November. We got the allocation for our DSG for 21-22 a few weeks after that meeting. Most forum members will be familiar with this. We've had a big increase in our schools block from 302 million to 324 million. 13.6 million of that 22.3 million increase is to do with the transferring of teachers' pay and pension grants. So it looks to be a big increase, but really it's not that big. It's about 8.7 million, I think, which is just under a 3% increase overall. The growth funding element went up slightly. This is what we use to deal with our pupil growth fund, and on top of that, we're having pressure within the secondary sector with the numbers coming through. We're having to create extra places, and this money is being used to help those schools accommodate those extra children. I've just been through the Central School Services block, the high needs block. Again, we're on a trajectory where we're getting significant increases in our high needs funding, but we are still spending, unfortunately, ahead of what they've given us for 21-22. So our high needs block has gone up from 43.1 million to 48.8 million. But when you consider that we spent something like 49.9 million in 2019-20, then we are still needing further increases in funding. And to be fair, the high needs national funding formula does indicate that we could get another 6 million at some stage on top of the 48.8 million. But we've still got significant issues to address within high needs. And there's the final picture, the early years block. It has gone up in the draft allocation that they have supplied. Whether when they confirm the effect of the January 21 census numbers, we're still at that level, remains to be seen. As we know, COVID has affected registrations within the early years sector, and it may be that the confirmed early years block allocation is less, but we'll keep forum updated when that happens. Any questions?
All right, that looks fine, David. Thanks for that.
And finally, just bear with me. Was the comparison of school allocations between funding year 2021 and funding year 21-22. So the biggest amount of funding has gone out on the basic entitlement funding, the age weighted pupil unit. So of that 22 million increase, 19.7 million of that has gone out on the age weighted pupil unit, and 13.5 million of that is to do with the transferring of the former teachers' pay and teachers' pension grants. So every primary age weighted pupil unit increased by £180. Every secondary age weighted pupil unit increased by £265. So there's also more money gone out on free school meals funding. We have an increased number of free school meals children in the authority. That's obviously linked to the COVID situation. We have more money in the EDACI factor, again to do with deprivation within the authority and the updated statistics that the government have provided to do with deprivation. English as an additional language has fallen slightly. That's because the EAL factor is 3-year limited. So the government make an assumption that once a child with English as a second language has been in the school system for 3 years, beyond that point, they don't need further support because they've acquired sufficient language skills for it to no longer be a barrier to them accessing the curriculum. Small increase in low prior attainment. We've reduced the lump sum to the national funding formula value. The double counting issue that we've previously considered at Forum meant that we could move to the national funding formula value of 117,800 this time. Business rates has come down. So there are some internal savings that we've been able to recycle within the system. The minimum per pupil funding that we have to satisfy because of ESFA regulations, that's cost 1.7 million more. But the saving grace is that with all the increased funding that's flowed through the factors above, the minimum funding guarantee has cost 2.67 million less in next year. So in terms of where we are in implementing the national funding formula, we are much closer to the national funding formula in 21-2 than we were in 2021. There was 10.6 million of protection above the national funding formula in our settlement in 2021. That's now fallen to 6.86 million. So every year we're getting closer to the point where all schools and academies are funded purely on the national funding formula. Okay.
That's excellent, David. Thank you very much. Very clear there. And I take it that it's good news that we're getting close to the national funding formula, because at some point they're going to implement this. They have continued to push it back, but are we close to a date where they're actually going to say that is it now? We are applying the NFF?
Well, for the last few years, the government have given indications of a point where they will move wholly to making allocations directly via the national funding formula to schools and academies. And it always seems to be pushed back. So the latest indication we have is that from financial year, funding year 22-23, they will be making direct allocations from the national funding formula to all schools. I would still expect that allocation to come through to the local authority to pass on to its maintained schools and not be able to change those figures from 22-23, but there will still have to be minimum funding guarantee protections for certain schools within that picture. So the fact that it's likely to move to the national funding formula distribution from next funding year doesn't necessarily mean a cliff edge for those schools that are in receipt of minimum funding guarantee protection. I would expect them to continue to do that.
Okay, that's excellent. We got Helen's just arrived, so welcome, Helen. Some computer problems there. Any other questions or comments in relation to item 8 now that it's completed? Right, thank you. That one's dealt with. So we come to any other business. Nothing was notified at the start. Does anybody have any other business or comments?
I've just got one item, Darren.
Yeah.
There's also been a consultation launched in the last few days by the DFE about the sparsity funding factor. You remember the sparsity funding factor was introduced in the national funding formula to protect those small schools that were serving really rural communities, whereby if there isn't efforts to actually keep the schools open in the location that they serve, then that would cause real problems for the area, in that the parents and the children would have a long drive, a long commute to the next nearest available school. So they are looking at changing the way the sparsity factor works. At the moment, it's based on something that looks at the distance between schools, and it's as the crow flies distance. So if your nearest school is over 3 miles away, then there is some support for that school from the national funding formula to keep open, if you like. One of the changes that they're looking at is saying, right, okay, let's not do it as the crow flies. Let's actually look at the actual travelling distance between the two schools, which I would imagine would bring more schools into the picture if they keep that 3 miles demarcation. The they've also made noises about supporting small schools in particular, because a lot of the minimum funding guarantee support protection that's in the system at the moment is helping the smaller primary schools exist. So although the sparsity funding consultation does not mention that factor in particular, I think there might be some mileage in us responding as a schools forum to the consultation to bring up the issue of small schools more generally, because I know that a lot of the small schools in the authority are particularly struggling. So, all well and good on the sparsity factor itself. I don't think that will help many Kirklees schools, given the nature of the geography of Kirklees. But I think it might be an opportunity for us to put some points about how we need to have maybe a small schools funding factor within the national funding formula. Otherwise, we're going to see some schools having real funding difficulties and ultimately viability questions if something doesn't change.
And that's obviously a big issue for Kirklees, given the nature of the geography of the place, and the fact that there are lots of rural areas around the big centres of you know, Huddersfield and so on.
Yeah,
so,
but ironically, we're not rural enough. Authorities like North Yorkshire, where you know you've got schools dotted about in the Dales,
yeah,
significantly benefit from the sparsity factor. But although we have rural areas, we have schools that are within 3 miles of each other.
I see. Well, pushing them on, at least using Google Maps rather than you know, as the crow flies, might at least give us some sort of extra argument there in some cases. All right, thanks for that one, David. Any other comments on David's item there under any other business? Okay. Confirm the dates of the next public meeting, Friday the 25th of June. Should we just agree the start time? Is it 10:30 or 10?
Let's go for 10.
Let's go for 10 a.m. And that's excellent. Thank you very much for that. Right, unless there are any other matters, we're going to close the meeting now to the public, and we're going to wish everybody a good day. All right. In that case, thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.